Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'll just start off by introducing myself. I'm Kendra Paspahala. I'm the Director for Disaster Response and Resiliency with the Rural Team. I just came on board about 4 months ago, and I'm excited to introduce two speakers today and hear a couple of their presentations. First, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping. If you could make sure that you're on mute, this will be interactive, so you do have the option of unmuting when you want to speak. So if you could keep your mic off until you are ready to speak, that would be much appreciated. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat box, but we will have a Q&A session at the end of each presentation, so folks can raise their hand and we'll call on you. And then we'll get to the questions in the chat box after we get to the hands. These slides and the video will be shared on the website afterward. So if you're curious and would like that content, that will be available. So our first presenter is kind of by request in a lot of ways. The topic was by request. One of the things that a lot of our partners asked for was some kind of help and guidance on how to help staff and clients that we may be working with in our network through a lot of the stresses that really occurred from COVID over this past year or two. And so by request, we've asked Dr. Maria Sarah, hopefully I said that correctly, to come speak to us. And so Dr. Maria Sarah, she is a researcher, positive psychologist, and inspirational speaker in resilience. She focuses on the capacity of the human spirit, particularly when under chronic stress and during significant transitions. She's the author of two books. One is A Short Course on Happiness After Loss, and the other is Every Day Counts. And so she travels the continent lecturing on topics such as resilience, flourishing, happiness, authenticity, and recovering from loss. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Kendra. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. It is such an honor to be with you. And before I go any further, I just really want to say in deep gratitude for the work you have chosen to do in this world. There is a beautiful Irish proverb that the people live in the shelter of each other. And that is no more true than in the domain in which you all work and share your care for humanity. I'm going to pivot pretty quickly to the screen deck because I wanted to introduce to you this notion that the most resilient of us have certain practices and perspectives that actually elevate us, even in the most difficult times. I come to you from an intersection of the traditional study of resilience in psychology, as well as a field that emerged about 30 years ago called positive psychology. And positive psychology asks the question, who are we at our best in the worst moments? And that research field, the study of positivity in the presence of the most difficult moments, have helped us understand that the most resilient of us, even in the hardest times, seek to increase both positivity and capacity. Positivity and capacity. And you see in front of you here a bowl that has been broken and then lined in the fractured places with gold lacquer. That bowl is an example of a Japanese form of art called kintsugi that emerged in the 15th century. And it actually represents what we know to be true about resilience beautifully. You see, resilience isn't about being strong versus not being strong. The old metaphor of resilience was the tree that could withstand the storm versus the tree that broke, right? It turns out actually that resilience looks and feels much more like this bowl that has been shattered and now put together and lined in the fractured places with gold lacquer. In other words, it's an experience of being both broken and whole at the same time, being fatigued and creative, being sad and hopeful, being frustrated and generous. Human beings have an astonishing capacity to hold multiple states at the same time. But what we know about the most resilient of us is that while we acknowledge that which is difficult, what is fractured or flawed or a little bit nutty or just incredibly frustrating, we pivot toward these two main sort of domains, the domain of building, increasing capacity, and building positivity. So I want to introduce to you in the short time that we have some foundational practices. And the first one is called the genius of the and. And it has to do with moving our minds, our brains, to a slightly better place. We're going to practice this in a moment, but for those of you on the call, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat the answer to the following question. During the time of the pandemic, have you ever found yourself jumping to a conclusion, yes or no? During the time of the pandemic, have you ever found yourself taking anything personally? Catastrophizing, any catastrophizing? Have you ever had a moment where you let your emotions cloud your judgment? Lots of yeses. Ever have a moment where something didn't go quite well and your first impulse, not your deepest impulse, but your first impulse was maybe to externalize, which means like point the finger somewhere else. If only I had a better boss, if only I had a better ref on the field, if only I had a better political leadership in my state. Anybody ever point the finger outside themselves? So welcome to humanity. These are what Dr. Karen Vivich at Penn calls common negative thought habits. And these common negative thought habits are just part of being human. They are what they are. But during a time of stress like the pandemic, when the two primary drivers of stress are present, uncertainty and lack of control, we are more likely to be triggered into these negative thought habits, and they lead quickly to non-resilient behavior. So let's imagine Kendra and I are working together. I send an email. I don't hear from her for 3 days. In a time of normal stress, I might think, well, that's curious. She's usually a pretty fast responder. I wonder what's going on. But in a time of high stress, like recovery from a pandemic, I'm much more likely to be triggered into jumping to conclusions and taking things personally. I'm much more likely, in other words, to think, oh my God, she doesn't like my email. She didn't like my email. She doesn't like my idea. She doesn't like my idea. She doesn't like me. I'm off the team. She's getting ready to fire me. That's it. I've lost my job, right? So under stress, we go to crazy town much more quickly. And these negative thought habits actually derail us from resilient behavior. So what the most resilient of us do is actually pivot from our negative thoughts, like catastrophizing and taking things personally, to a much more resilient mindset. So the first step we have to do, we're going to practice this now, is acknowledge the negative thought that we are having, and then build in an and. And on the other side of the and, we want to move toward a thought that is slightly positive, not Disney fantastically positive, but slightly positive and true, meaning we actually believe it. So one of the examples the negative thoughts I've been living with is I'm so frustrated with this part of my job. I can't stand it. And I can ask for help, and I can bring in a mentor, and I know how to be kind. Those are 3 positive and true thoughts that came to me when I was putting this slide together on the day that I was incredibly frustrated with a certain part of my job. It had to do with the marketing part. So those of you on the call, I would love for you, if you feel comfortable, in the chat, put in a negative kind of ruminative thought that you've had a number of times during the pandemic. Could be about yourself, could be about the world. So it could be like something like, I'm not doing enough. I'm too tired all the time. We can't trust other people. The world isn't safe. So either about the self or about the world in general, but a kind of negative ruminative thought that you might have been wrestling with in the last year. So for Susie, I'm just inadequate. I'm not appreciated. Yep. And again, we all have these. The Dalai Lama has these. Thich Nhat Hanh has these. I can't keep up with expectations. I'm not doing enough as a mom, a wife, employee. My child will never be able to make it on his own. Exactly. This is exactly where we lose a lot of mental energy And these thoughts trigger negative emotions pretty quickly. And they lead again to non-resilient behavior. We isolate, we armor up, we defend, we attack. So now we want to build in the and. And on the other side of the and, what we're looking for, again, is a thought that is slightly positive and true. So for today, I'm going to say, I'm not good enough as a mom. And on the other side of the and, I do my best every day to think about what they need. That's true. Okay, so let's practice. Type in an and on the other side of the and, a thought that is slightly positive and true. Just one thought that's slightly positive and true. And I'm there for my kid when she needs me to read a book to her, right? And I'm doing more than I ever have, right? Not perfect, and I'm learning, right? And he will make mistakes along the way to grow up, right? Which is okay. Gorgeous examples. Thank you all. This is a simple but incredibly impactful tool. You see, the most resilient of us acknowledge what is difficult. We acknowledge the negative thoughts, the difficult ruminative thoughts, but we don't stay there. We make the conscious choice to move toward the other side, the and I work hard to be the best at my job I can be. Now I'd like to one more reflection before we move off of this skill into the next one. Please type into the chat how it feels to be on the other side of the and. Did you notice any shift in how you felt about yourself or about the world when you got to the other side of the and? Any change in feeling in your body or feeling in your heart? A little more of this, a little less of that. Lightness, calmer, exactly. This is what we're looking for, a little more grace. We're not looking for everything to feel fantastically perfect because it's not, and it's not gonna be. We are in like phase 3 of the pandemic. In the beginning of the pandemic, of course, we were worried predominantly about health and well-being, living versus dying. Then we were very concerned in the mental health world about the rising rates of depression and anxiety. Now, what we're mostly concerned about, in addition, of course, to physical health and well-being, safety, is burnout, is just exhaustion, weariness, just world weariness. And in order to mitigate or inoculate is a better word, inoculate against burnout, we need to be in this positive state a little more often. Notice, again, I'm not asking you to pivot toward, wonderful fantasy, Disney kind of moments, just slightly better thoughts. So that's the first foundational practice. A second foundational practice has to do with increasing appreciation. What researchers like Barbara Fredrickson at the University of North Carolina, Tal Ben-Shahar at Harvard, I can't remember the last name of the researcher who's currently at Yale, Laura, it'll come to me. What they have all uncovered is that human beings actually do better and are more resilient in states of positivity, because positive states create a building of internal resources. So for example, if you're feeling calmer or more relief or a little more grace, you actually have more energy within your system to take positive action. One of the ways in which we have found that the most of us actually prevent burnout and activate capacity within ourselves is to increase gratitude. So I'm going to ask you to fill into the chat an answer to 3 quick appreciation prompts. The first is, what do I appreciate about my work during COVID? So what's one thing you appreciate? As hard and stressful as your work might be, what is one thing that you can say you appreciate about your work during this time? Let's throw an answer into the chat. Let's see. I kept my job and was able to work. I can help people. I get to help people. It's a different kind of help I'm providing than before COVID. So you're learning new things, offering new kinds of assistance. Yep. able to help organizations on the ground directly, struggling with finances, gorgeous. So even though there is much to be stressed and strained about, there is at least one thing to appreciate. A second prompt I'd love, what so far? So here on the East Coast, I'm looking at my clock, it's 12:47 in the afternoon. Whatever time zone you're in, what's been the best moment of the day so far? Best moment of the day so far for you? Just this one day, this Wednesday day. Let's have a couple of answers in the chat. Best moment of the day so far. Honestly, when the day, okay, no, Susie, let's stay with the day so far. Is it that you had a good cup of coffee in the morning? My son slept in. I got a lovely text from my husband. Yep. I got to video chat my boyfriend who's away on a mountain biking trip, coworkers teasing me, calm cup of tea with my dog. Excellent. Thank you for these. Now, let's imagine that for the next 30 nights, just before you close your eyes, you ask yourself this simple question. What's been the best moment of the day so far? Here's what would happen if you did this 30 nights in a row. Number one, you would learn that every day, even the darkest days, have a best moment. The day my younger brother died of stage 4 cancer, there was a best moment. The day my 20-year-old relationship fell apart, there was a best moment. The day COVID-19 hit, there was a best moment. Now, some days, the best moment is as simple as a calm cup of tea. It doesn't get any better than that, right? That was one good moment maybe for Sarah, and that's it. Other days, of course, the moments are going to be much more profound. A lovely text, hanging out, teasing with my colleagues, having a great time. I got to sleep in a little. And then some days, of course, the best moments are miraculous. They are astonishing moments of grace and wonder and goodness. But if you were to do this 30 nights in a row, a couple of things would happen. Number one, every day would have a best moment. Number two, because you know you have to do your homework at night, in other words, you have to have an answer to this question, you would be in the day looking for best moments. And because we're in the day looking for them, we actually see them and savor them more. They're always there. There's always at least one best moment. We just don't notice them and we forget to savor them. The third thing that will happen is that the neurons that fire together in our brain in states of appreciation begin to wire together more strongly, which means we begin to build a brain that neurochemically is much more likely to pivot toward the positive. We're not denying reality. We're not denying the fact that many days are excruciating or boring or fatiguing or a mixed bag. And we're also not denying the reality that good moments exist everywhere if only we pay attention to them. Again, why is it important to put our awareness, our brains, our hearts in the positive? Because that's where energy, vitality, that's actually where our best thinking is. Research at Harvard has demonstrated that our brains do better in states of positivity in terms of creativity, innovation, collaboration, cooperation. This is where health lives. The longitudinal studies that have been performed around the world demonstrate over and over again that those of us who live a slightly more positive life than negative do better in terms of health outcomes. So profound benefits of continuing to integrate in the positive. Best moment of the day, 30-day practice that you can do at night. Simple, fast skill, easy to learn, easy to apply. And I know plenty of people have applied this tool with their families, like asking best moment of the day around the dining room table, for example, during dinner. One more quick appreciation tool for you. This is research done by Dina Nir over in Israel. She had students who were struggling with either depression or pessimism, a kind of weariness and fatigue, which many of us are experiencing now. And she asked them for 2 weeks in a row to write down simply 3 things you're looking forward to tomorrow. 3 things I'm looking forward to tomorrow. And just the simple act of reflecting. So this is appreciation moving forward, right, into the next day. Just the simple practice of writing down what I'm looking forward to tomorrow relieved pessimism and increased energy and vitality. The other cool, funky thing that happened is that some days we only have one thing we're looking forward to tomorrow. But because the students were participating in the experiment, they kind of had to make up two things to look forward to so they could have three answers. And what they began to do was actually prioritize things in the next day that they could feel good about, that they could look forward to. So they began to actually build positive moments into their future, their near future. So any one of these would be a great tool to practice sort of a daily appreciation for your work, best moment of the day, or three things that you might be looking forward to. A third foundational practice that is absolutely critical in this time has to do with self-care. You all, I know, are profoundly devoted to the care and well-being of others. And often when we have chosen to be in a profession such as yours, we forget to balance out care for the self versus care for the other. There's a beautiful expression in Judaism that we ought to be walking around with a piece of paper in each pocket. And in one pocket is written, "You are nothing but dust and ashes," meaning nobody, everybody's the same, right? Everybody's equal. We're all going to end up in the same place. But in the other pocket ought be written, "For you, this world was created. You matter. You are significant." And in the kind of work that you've chosen to do so beautifully, so profoundly, often we forget to pull out that other piece of paper and remind ourselves that we matter. Now, self-care can be complicated, time-consuming. We can get lost in feeling like we need to devote a lot of time and energy and attention to self-care. But when work is pressing, when change is constant, when stress is evident, we want to actually build in what we call a micro practice of self-care. And the prompt there is to choose one thing, I'm typing in the chat, one thing each day, just one thing that either inspires you or strengthens you or calms you. Inspires, strengthens, or calms. You see, if we take all of the research about resilience, essentially all resilience practices and perspectives fall into one of these three pathways. It either calms us down, or it strengthens our inner capacity, or it elevates and inspires us. It motivates us. So just today, Wednesday, what's one thing? I just love for you to throw in the chat, just one thing that you could do at some point today for just a few moments, not asking for hours here. We're looking for 10 minutes or one interaction that might inspire, strengthen, or calm you. So let's see some examples in the chat. So Kendra would go running. Yes, Carrie, I do jigsaw puzzles. Maybe you do crosswords. I do jigsaw puzzles. Love it. So soothing. Dance party with your toddler. Play the piano, swim, workout, pray. Gorgeous examples. Play with my kids. Absolutely. So best moment of the day is an evening practice. 3 things I'm looking forward to. You could do it anytime during the day. This self-care inquiry, we call it a self-care inquiry, we encourage you to do at the beginning of the day. Imagine waking up and instead of running right to the to-do list or the activities, and those of you with little ones at home, of course, as soon as you wake up, you're on. I understand that. We have 5 kids between us, my partner and I get it. And what would it be like to pause even in those first few moments and think, what's one thing I could do today to either strengthen, calm, or inspire myself? The last thing I want to say about this practice is some days we need to calm down. That's like our best next step. Some days we need to inspire and motivate ourselves. And some days we need to feel inner capacity. Now, any one of the answers might actually fulfill more than one category, but you want to just be thoughtful about, what do I need today? Do I need to calm down? Do I need to feel like I can handle this inside? Or do I need hope? Do I need inspiration? Do I need like a North Star out there? What's going to get me there? I have one last fast skill to share with you that the most resilient of us do. And then we're going to open it up for questions. This is a practice that's important for us as individuals, but also beautiful for us as teams. And it comes from work by Teresa Amabile and her colleague, Stephen Kramer, who came to understand that the highest performing teams and the most resilient teams periodically pause and celebrate their gains. They celebrate their wins, their successes, and they celebrate progress. Not everything, and I'm sure you know this in your work, not everything gets like fully, finally fixed or resolved. Sometimes some of the things we are working on they're like constant. Like we're always going to be worried about poverty. We're always going to be worried about food insecurity in this part of the country. Like it's going to be a while, in other words. So the highest performing, most resilient teams celebrate gains and they celebrate progress. So one last time in the chat, what is one thing that you feel good about that you either now know or can now do? A gain you've made, either for yourself or with your team, let's say over the last 3 months. So just one gain, one progress move, one accomplishment that you can celebrate. One thing you can now do. We started a very cool new project. Congratulations. Increase cross-team communication and connection. Gorgeous. What else? Increased visibility. Well done, Sarah. Let's see if we can get at least one more example. Beautiful, beautiful. So now I'd like you to throw in the chat, and then we're going to open it up for questions. How does it make you feel to celebrate a gain? Again, did you notice any difference in how you felt about yourself or how your body was feeling, maybe even how you feel about your team? Any shifts from acknowledging these gains? Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. Empowered and hopeful and relieved, more energy. Right. These are conversations that teams want to have. Of course, we have to have conversations about what's not working, what we need to get done, and what the pressures are. And if you want to sustain team resilience over time, at quarterly staff meetings, weekly team meetings, any progress report meetings, take a moment and notice how long it took you. It did not take you long to come up with a gain. We're making progress all the time. We just often forget to acknowledge it. So it'll take a few minutes and it will be so worth the investment. All right. I'm going to pause here and open it up for any questions. You can post in the chat. And Kendra, remind me, are they able to unmute themselves and ask questions? Yes.
Yes, you all should be able to unmute yourself. So in the chat, you also have, if you look at the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, if you click on that, you also have the ability to raise your hand as well.
So feel free to raise your hand. We'd love to know that you have a question or a reflection on how this is landing for you. So from Sarah, a lot like CBT. Yeah, there's a lot in positive psychology that's kind of CBT-esque. How do we apply this at the organizational levels? So first of all, slides are available. The recording can be available, and absolutely share them. First, I'd love for you to just practice them individually for a few days, like just choose one, Sarah, whether it's the appreciation practice or it's celebrating gains or it's practice it for yourself just a few days so it lands, and then absolutely feel free to bring it to the team. Now, no one likes to be told we have to do this differently, right? Either no individual, no team. So the way I suggest that you integrate it is by saying there's a tremendous amount of research about the benefit of this kind of tool. I've tried it myself. It actually makes a positive difference. Would you mind experimenting with me with this? And then choose one and build it into your team structure. So if you have a weekly staff meeting, go around the table, do best moment of the day, if you like that tool. If you hear each other jumping to conclusions, catastrophizing, taking things personally, say, can we pause as a team and build in an and here? So build it in, but don't worry about doing all of them. Just choose the one that feels the most relevant and think of it as an experiment. I'm glad, Susie, it feels like it has some application for you. Any other questions or just reflections on how this is landing? Like what do you think might be useful about this material? Kendra, I'm curious of everything you heard today, what might be the most beneficial for you to apply?
I think I'm more thinking of past jobs, but definitely been in a lot of high stress, high pressure, things are moving fast. So I think some of the exercises around like calming would particularly have relevance. Those moments to step back and what would calming, what can I do right now?
Right.
We do have a question. Yeah.
Sorry, just to follow up, I really appreciate the thoughts here. Oh, come on a little bit rather than talking to a blank screen. Hi, thank you so much. And so I'm thinking also of applying nationally across many organizations. So we're great partners with Ruralisk, and like them, we have a network too. And so I know that we often bounce ideas off each other. That's why I really appreciate this session so much, because we've heard from so many of these groups, which many also are partners with Ruralisk, of that we're fried. We are so fried. And so I think of not so much my team, and I'm trying to think of from the perspective of someone who provides resources or just tries to put out, sort of things across a national level that would be assisting to organizations. That's where I'm thinking. Like I'm really grateful for my team and our partners. And yet I'm thinking, if I'm not actually in that organization, perhaps it's showing some of that research, like you were saying, of just saying, here's some great resources. We've heard you're burned. That's where my mind is sort of doing, is just trying to provide some scaffolding if they so choose it.
Yeah. So the number one preventer of burnout is recovery. And recovery happens when we practice daily self-care. Now, organizations can facilitate recovery. Some do that a much better job of that than others. But if I were only going to teach one thing at this time to a national network, I would remind them that the number one preventer of burnout is actually recovery. And we can take personal responsibility. Resilience is a stance of personal responsibility and personal leadership to activate it on behalf of ourselves so that we can continue to show up. The second, if I were only going to do one other thing nationally, I would build in the template and the habit of celebrating progress. That research is beautiful and it's easy and it makes a profound difference. Think of any project you've ever had that's complex and is going to take a long time to resolve, or that you need a lot of cooperation from various members across different teams and systems. You want to build in this habit practice of celebrating gains. And that doesn't need to be done every time you meet, but it's once a week or once a month, but make it part of the value system of the conversations that you have. Does that make sense?
Indeed. Yeah. I think this is great too. Not only at the national scale, but then again, just working with organizations if they want to do more. It's sort of, as Kendra knows, it's sort of this place that we're in of sort of working with organizations at the very minute level of within their organization, but then also working across all of them. So I appreciate all the different tools. And as I said, it is just a lot like the CBT. I felt like I was back in my kid's therapist office. So that's great.
Yeah. The initial founders of positive psychology really came out of a CBT background. And one of the reasons that sort of emphasis has sustained is because the research is so dramatic. Positive psychology science is global. And like I can quote you from the University of Melbourne to Spain to Italy to Africa. Like this data is what I brought to you as a combination of global resources that have been proven effective in individuals, families, teams, and communities. So just checking in. I have one more slide to show you, but any other questions or reflections? Okay. So just a kind of summary slide. We began with the metaphor, the current metaphor of resilience. It's this bowl that has been broken and now lined in the fractured places with gold lacquer. That gold lacquer I think of as the tools and the perspectives that enable us to move forward. I wanted to close by reminding you as well that there's a deep paradox built into resilience, which is the paradox that we can be both fractured and whole, anxious and hopeful, imperfect and resilient overall, which means that resilience is really not a stance of feeling like everything's good or everything's getting better. It actually looks and feels like this is exhausting and I've got more in me to give, right? We are so tired of having to deal with this particular problem, and we are going to show up as our best selves anyway, right? So it's a much more integrated way of understanding. And the beautiful news is that human beings have demonstrated this capacity to hold multiple states at the same time throughout centuries, in the worst moments, in the boring moments, and in moments of opportunity as well. Kendra, I wanted to thank you for the time today to be with everyone. I would love for you, before we close out, to throw into the chat the best idea that you either heard during this conversation or that it triggered in you. Like the best, is it about self-care? Is it about appreciation? Is it about celebrating gains? Is it about building in the and, or is it just the metaphor? Is that going to be helpful to you? Like, what's the thing that's just the one thing you want to take with you from this conversation? Thank you, Joelle. Yeah, we forget that we're all human. So the remembering of the humanity, building in the and. Love that from Susie. Great. Thanks, Susie. Focusing on the positive. Yep. Appreciation for Carrie. Yep. When I first learned about the and, I wanted to, I don't have any tattoos. I wanted to tattoo it on my arm. I wanted to like not forget because, oh, there I go again, taking it personal. Oh, there I go again, jumping to conclusions. Yeah. Super glue the base and then paint it gold. Beautiful, Mallory. Thank you. Yes. So as you go about your day, the rest of the day today, I invite you to actually remember the and, to consider that even just a few moments of self-care, and you all have data now, you've all reminded yourself what self-care might look and feel like. A moment of appreciation, just one of these, or celebrating, what do I now know? What can I now do? Celebrating some gains. Just one moment puts you in the stance of personal leadership that is absolutely crucial to living a resilient life. Thank you again for everything you're doing. Kendra, I want to pass the mic back to you to help transition to the next speaker and see if there are any last questions or reflections from you about this.
This is amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that we get to maybe bring you into future projects as well to continue these conversations with some of our partners. I will now introduce our next speaker, Carrie Cullen. Thank you again, Maria. Carrie Cullen is the director for the Midwest Recovery Fund at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. And she's going to be chatting with us today, telling us what the Center for Disaster Philanthropy does, as well as kind of basically some information and understanding of the philanthropy space in the disaster context. She's based out of North Dakota, previously was with Lutheran Social Services, focusing in disaster case management and recovery program. She's been a project manager for the Midwest Consortium of Disaster Services, and she focuses on addressing the unique needs of communities and individuals in disaster recovery and fostering the assets and strengths of the community to build capacity and strengthen resilience. So with no further ado, I will kick it over to you, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Kendra. I am so excited to be with all of you today. I'm just gonna, I think I have my screen shared. So I have a lot to cover, and I'm just gonna, start by saying I'm gonna talk really fast. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. You can either pop something in the chat, and Kendra knows that she can interrupt me too, or just come off mute and ask your question. I would love it if we were in the same room together. I have been wishing for that for, I don't know. I just need to be with people again. Maybe you all feel that way as well, but here we are on a screen together again. So please feel free to, again, interact with this as much as you would like. And I'm happy and excited to be here with you. Let's see if I can advance my screen. There we go. Just to start out, I wanted to share that I live in West Fargo, North Dakota. And I just wanted to just do a quick acknowledgement that the land that I reside on is the traditional lands of the Ochite, Shakowee, and the Anishinaabe people. I want to honor the many diverse and indigenous people that are still connected to these lands. I also, just right across the street, is the Wakpasha, which is also known as the Red River, which is a key trade and transportation route for countless original people. As I reflect on the culture and the traditions of my ancestors and learn more and more about the culture and the traditions and the history of those who came before me in this land, I want to just acknowledge the legacy of colonialism and the structural racism that continues to be pervasive in our communities. And just want to kind of lay this groundwork that what we talk about today, I hope, leads to equitable disaster recovery for everyone that lives in the communities that we call home. I put this picture up to get us started because this is a picture of what feels like home to me. And it's that storm clouds are rolling, but there's that piece of the sunshine. It's that that Maria was just talking about, right? But this is what feels like home to me. I was born and raised in a town of about 6,000 people outside of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a community called Madison. And I spent my life there as a youngster. My parents intentionally took me out places to experience the world. My dad took me on a trip to Haiti as a 14-year-old, and then down to Mexico City area in high school as well to experience the world. But to me, the big place to go was Minneapolis. And so I went to college in Minneapolis, St. Paul, spent lots of time in that, which was what I thought was the big city. And then I moved to Freetown, Sierra Leone, West Africa, and spent some time in an even bigger city. Came back home and found myself in many small communities across the Odas. So I consider myself an Oda girl, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota. And now I'm in North Dakota. And I come here and I come to CDP and my job with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy with a background of working with children, working with resilience and preparedness pieces as a disaster case manager. And Kendra kind of listed some of those pieces. But I'm excited to be a part of, I've been a part of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy now for the last 2 years. And I love my job here because what I get to do is I get to interact with communities in some of the worst times of their lives, with individuals and households in some of the worst times of their lives, but also in some of the best times. Because what I know about disaster is that it brings out those events, those crisis events, they bring out not only the worst in community, but they also bring out the best in community. So one of the very first disasters that I had the opportunity to go and respond to was the Moore, Oklahoma tornado. And I'll never forget walking into the community and walking to that fence outside that elementary school where children had died. and feeling that grief and that loss and that trauma, the heaviness and the heartbreak of the community, but also seeing on the outside of that fence just hundreds and thousands of t-shirts that were signed by groups of people that rushed into the community to help in whatever way they could, that offered food and helped with shelter and water and supplies and did that kind of amazing work. And we saw the community come together in beautiful ways. And so that's what I love. And we'll talk a little bit about the opportunity that disaster kind of creates and generates in communities. And that's what I do, why I do this, right, is to see and to know and to kind of spark and catalyze that hope and that opportunity that disaster really brings for us. So who is the Center for Disaster Philanthropy? So we started just a little over 10 years ago, primarily with this purpose and this understanding that philanthropy, so funders, we're talking high wealth individuals and foundations and corporations, needed resources to be able to better understand what strategies should we put in place when we think about how to give post-disaster, and knowing that most disaster giving happens right away after the disaster, and most disaster spending, at least on the private, the foundation, the philanthropic side, most disaster spending happens really quickly as well. But that long-term recovery, this need for community to be able to rebound and recover fully, takes a long time and is actually the most expensive part of disaster. So could we and can we, and what we continue to do, is try to influence philanthropy to begin to understand kind of how to more strategically give so those dollars make the most impact after disaster. So that's one of our buckets. The other bucket, another bucket that I primarily work in, is the grant making and recovery funds area. So we make grants to communities. We have international grants, we have domestic US-based grants, and then I run the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, which is a specific lane of grants that we make in the US. But those recovery funds sometimes are event specific, they're named after event. Some of them are broader, like we have a Atlantic Hurricane Fund, where people are pooling their money, their dollars, their resources. We have individuals, foundations, corporations that put their money into these funds, and then we model what we believe looks like effective and strategic post-disaster grant making. Our third bucket is consulting work. So we work with a lot of corporations and foundations to set up their strategy around what they're going to do post-disaster giving. And in that, some of them say, we don't have the infrastructure or the will to set up a full infrastructure to do disaster giving well. Can you guys carry this piece for us? Which those funds then transition into our recovery funds and grant making. And other times we help them set that piece up, and they move forward with what we believe are these leading trends and ideas around disaster giving. So those are three primary buckets. What are we talking about? When we talk about disaster recovery at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we're not only talking about structures and systems and services, although we all know that those things are critical, but we're also talking about the whole community. We're talking about individuals and families, and we're talking about their ability to rebound from their losses, right? So, and all kinds of losses. We're also talking about the ability to sustain their physical, social, economic, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So sometimes when we think about disaster, people are just thinking about that immediate, here's the event, right? Here's the tornado. What's the next 2 weeks until we get people stabilized and they all have food and a place to live and they have the things that they need, and then we're good to go, right? Instead, we're saying this is a long-term process, and it's about so much more than having that structure ready to go. It's about so much more than making sure that the roads are replaced, although that's critical. It's about the whole person and the whole community around that. So just this, you'll have these slides. These are all links, I believe, that you can link and check out all of these resources that we have available to you. And if you go to disasterphilanthropy.org, you're going to find our disaster philanthropy playbook. which is with the main audience, again, is funders, because that's our main audience, but there's also great tips that you can use in any place that you are in your community after disaster. There's strategies that work really well. There's case studies and examples of other communities and other nonprofits and other groups and networks and what they have done after disaster to bring their community back to wholeness. Our website is just full. And if any of the staff that are listed on the website, we are all just an email or a phone call away. We'd love to connect and chat with people. We have a monthly webinar that's available. We have this State of Disaster Philanthropy, which I'm going to show you a snapshot of here in a second. And then our Household Disaster Giving Report, which that one gives you a really good idea of, as we surveyed households, when do they give? Why do they give? And then what happens to those dollars as they go out? So a couple things on that one. We know that people give when they're asked. A lot of people, when they were asked, like, why didn't you give to a disaster? They said, nobody asked me. We know they give really quickly after disaster, which means we have to be prepared to receive those dollars and those funds pretty quickly from individuals and households. And we know that they give because there's a connection. They grew up in that community. They have an aunt that lives there. They vacationed there. There's some sort of a connection that ties them back into that specific event that leads them to give. So our Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy is a report that comes out once a year. It comes out in October. And then it's 2 years lag time, because what happens along with Candid is they pull 990 information from foundations across the globe and kind of learn from them. What did their disaster giving look like? Who did they give to? What strategies were used in that? How much? What are they interested in? And for me, when I worked disaster recovery on the other side of the spectrum, where I was looking for dollars to be able to utilize in my community post-disaster, I would come here and I would find out which foundations funded in my region that were also interested in disaster, that I could make a connection to it. I would find what kinds of things are they interested in funding and where does that go? And so it's just a useful tool. It's available for free. You can get on there. It's got stuff from the whole globe. And I find it fascinating. We're going to dive in a little bit to a piece of the data later, but that's a tool that's available to you to use. So just to transition slightly, I want to talk a little bit about the Midwest Early Recovery Fund and the work that I do, because I think it'll just kind of keep us moving along and point you so you kind of get an understanding of where my expertise and assistance might lie for you later as events potentially happen and when things happen and maybe how we can connect and partner in that. So I show you this picture of flooding because for the Midwest, for the region that I work in, which is a 10-state region, we've got Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, down to Oklahoma and Arkansas. When I think of that region and what I know from what we have funded in the past, it is primarily around flooding events, because our purpose is really to provide communities who've experienced a low attention disaster with resources. So these disasters, we call them low attention for a couple of reasons, right? They might not get a FEMA individual assistance declaration, which means households in that community, they don't have any assistance. And we know the flooding goes back to 95% of households who experience a flood are uninsured or underinsured. So these families who think that their insurance is kind of undergirding what's happening and what they've built in their homes, find out after a flood that their insurance isn't going to cover it. And then they start to look and they go, well, then the government's going to step in. And when they don't get that individual assistance declaration, and there's all kinds of reasons for it, but especially for rural communities, is because we don't meet the ratio and the requirement, the return on investment kind of equation that FEMA has in place. So they don't receive that individual and household level assistance. So we call that low attention. We've even started to call disasters that have that get that kind of a declaration, get that kind of assistance from FEMA, low attention disasters as well, because usually when that money comes in, it's small and it's limited. So I think the average individual assistance dollars that goes out to an individual household, the average right now is right around $3,000. So you and I know that if we've lost everything, or we've lost the majority of our things, $3,000 is not going to get us very far when we try to recover from a disaster. So we need other resources, we need other things to come into play to make sure that our communities can rebound and be whole again. So low attention, there's no FEMA individual assistance declaration. There's limited national or regional attention. So what we, from the media. So we know from the media that the more attention a disaster receives, the more dollars that are going to come into the community. So in these types of disasters, there's very limited attention that comes in. And so there's the trickle, the dollars that flow, at least from individuals and households, is going to be very small. These communities that have low attention disasters have insufficient community resources or infrastructure to meet the needs of their populations. There's a disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations in that community. So sometimes they say disaster is when the hazard meets the vulnerability. And what happens is there's often a disproportionate impact on the older adults in the community, on children in the community, on immigrants and refugees and migrant workers in the community. Sometimes it's on the agricultural community. Whatever that is, if there's a disproportional impact and there's not the resources that are needed to meet that needs, we call that a low attention disaster. And then the big one I would say is that there's limited or no response from regional or national partners. So more and more as disasters increase in intensity and frequency around the world and around our country, what we're seeing is those, what I would call professional disaster organizations, the ones that we know, the Red Cross, Team Rubicon, other big, the Mennonite disaster response, the church disaster responses like the United Methodists and the Lutherans, as they are called to do more and more, and their capacity is stretched more and more of our small or rural communities are left to really do disaster on their own. And that's where we see our place as the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, is to really come in and be a part of those kinds of recovery. So we do a pretty in-depth needs assessment to understand what's happening in the community. We provide funding. We also provide a lot of technical assistance, conversations with the community and with the leadership of the community to understand what their needs are and to help them with that. We also do a lot of technical assistance to potential funders for that community. So the Community Foundation or other foundations that are connected. And then one of the things that I say is our biggest thing is to connect to our broad network. So CDP and the Midwest Early Recovery Fund has worked really intentionally to develop a really broad network of professional disaster organizations, of potential funders, of in-kind donators, all of these things, so that when something happens that needs additional attention, I can wave the flag and say, hey, can you come over here? Can you think about bringing your assistance and whatever you have over to this community who's kind of been left behind in the recovery process? I'm going to skip a couple slides, that slide there. So the question is, I think, what's the big deal, right? Especially when we think about a flood, that water recedes, people seem like they're back at home. The piles of debris out in front of the house are gone and people have gone back to their everyday life, right? So why should we think about recovery? Why not just focus our resources and our time on that relief and making sure that those things happen? And I would say those things are critical. We need to focus our time on meeting basic needs for people. But if we don't also think about whole community recovery and sufficient recovery for the entire community, people start to leave. And we know in our small communities that we feel that loss. As people start to leave, we feel that loss, right? And what happens when people leave is we end up with blighted neighborhoods. We end up with increased taxes. We lose school revenue because we lose teachers and we lose students. And so there's issues that kind of trickle and cascade because of that. We have more public debt shared by fewer taxpayers. All of these things kind of begin to trickle and form as people, if we don't help people recover, as they are forced to leave our community because they have to have a safe place to live in order to have a job. So we see loss of workforce and business development opportunities, losses of small business owners who go somewhere else where they can do that work differently, loss of jobs and increased unemployment. So one example I would share on that is a small community that had a flood that decided that there was a particular area of their town that had a lot of mobile homes, that area did not need to be recovered, that they were going to be okay if they just let those people leave, right? What happened in the trickle down of that is that what they found out was that was the workforce for their local nursing home. And so they lost the workforce for their nursing home, and then their nursing home had to close down. They also lost a whole bunch of students that were enrolled in their school district. And so the school district had a loss of revenue and had to cut jobs from teachers, and it just began to snowball. And they realized how important that kind of segment in that sector of their community is. And if they could go back and do it over again, I think that they would. So people will leave our communities if we don't focus on recovery, or people will stay because of a variety of reasons. They stay, but we see an increase in mental health and wellness issues. We see an increase in suicide in communities where recovery hasn't been addressed. We see increases in domestic violence and divorce, drug and alcohol problems, and even early death for communities. And overall, what happens if we don't have some sort of system and some idea of recovery in place is that there's just this eroding of community trust and this eroding of social capital and connection and ability. And then you go back to, more and more people leaving again, becomes this vicious cycle. So that's the bad news. The good news is that what disaster often also does is it creates opportunities. It puts your community in the spotlight. It also has the potential to create this new sense of urgency. Those things that you've known are problems all along, but you haven't really had anybody that's interested in funding it or interested in helping out with it or whatever that is, right? Now, all of a sudden it's urgent. Housing is a good example. We've known all along that there's a need for additional affordable housing and some intentionality that needs to be put on it. Now that we've had a disaster, all of a sudden we can no longer ignore this kind of piece of our community, and more people get invested in making sure that it changes and happens. The same thing goes with vulnerabilities. For COVID, what we saw over and over was communities that didn't really understand or recognize that there was a significant population in their community that did not speak or read English. And so all of a sudden, they couldn't ignore that anymore because those messages of safety and all of those messages needed to go out to that community. So what are they going to do to make sure that happens? They have additional conversations about that. Disaster creates an opportunity to build new partnerships, to develop new funds, to make new mitigation projects happen, right? So people don't want to talk about preparedness and mitigation until after the disaster happens. And then all of a sudden they're ready and they're willing to think about, worst case scenarios and what are the things that we can put in place to make sure that when this happens again, the impacts are less. And then there's all of these federal and state dollars that potentially become available for your community to work with and to utilize and to use. So we're going to move into kind of this piece around funding. And it's the question that we get asked all the time: how do we fund disaster recovery, right? So you're the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Where does the funding come from and how does this all work? So I'm just going to say this is a huge, broad up here kind of overview. And again, I am more than happy, and we as an organization are more than happy to kind of talk through that with you and provide any individual kind of assistance that we can from based off of our understanding and our research about disaster philanthropy. So what does disaster giving look like? So we know this, right? It's largely reactive and it's quick. So you've got about 4 weeks following a disaster event in which over a third of private giving is complete. So if you're thinking about setting up a fund that you're asking individuals and households to donate to so that you can lead recovery efforts in your community, after those first 2 months, you've already seen 2/3 of those donations of that private giving. And after 6 months, all of that giving pretty much stops and trickles out. But we know that recovery takes years. What else do we know about disaster giving? We know that 80% of individual donations are going to arrive within days after disaster strikes. So what that means for our local communities is that we need to start thinking about, are we ready to capitalize on that need to generate dollars quickly? And if we're also thinking about recovery, do we have a plan to make sure that not all of those dollars that come in within days after disaster go out within days after disaster? So many communities, they will generate a fund, they will take in a lot of dollars, and 2 weeks or 2 months afterwards, they realize that they have expended all of that money. And the tough part, the rebuilding of houses and the rebuilding of lives, has just begun to happen. So what's our plan for that? Also, here's what we know. This is from the State of Disaster Philanthropy report from 2018, that 50% of those dollars that come in go to this response and relief portion of disaster. Again, it's critical. It's critical to make sure that basic human needs are met and that people have at least a place, they have shelter, they have water, they have food, they're reunited with their family. Those pieces are put into place. But we also need to start thinking about, how do we use our money for reconstruction and recovery? And you see only about 12% of giving goes towards that. Preparedness is huge, and only about 4% in 2018 went to that. Just a snapshot to look at too is that this is 2018 numbers. So there was about $76 billion in 2018 that went to disasters, primarily in the US. And you can see that the government dollars are much higher than the philanthropic funds. So we can't as philanthropists do the same thing that the government does. Our job is to look for where are the gaps and the things that the government can't do, knowing and understanding that there are partners, and we need those dollars to make sure that communities recover and have access, and communities need access to that money. But we also understand that the philanthropic funding, that's where we can fill some of those gaps in some of those places that the government funding cannot fill for us. And you'll see on the philanthropic funds that $3 billion of those dollars in 2018 was actually from households. So again, that's the highest amount is coming from individuals and US households as far as the philanthropic gifts. COVID has changed everything for all of us in so many ways. This is just the six months after COVID started. So in 2020, our data showed that over $11.9 billion was donated philanthropically to COVID response and recovery, right? So Hurricane Harvey is the next largest, which is the next one that we have data for, 342 million in the first 6 months. So there was a significant increase in philanthropic giving for disasters with COVID. And we're not yet sure how that's going to trickle out and how that's going to change kind of the landscape and the giving scene as far as what's going to happen in the future. But we're monitoring it and watching it and trying to figure out what this, get our hands and wrap ourselves around what this is going to mean for not only for us in the future, but for communities who've experienced disaster in the future. All funders are disaster funders. All of us do disaster work. It doesn't matter what kind of your lane is, what your organization is. When a disaster impacts your community, all of you are doing disaster work. And all of you are probably doing disaster mitigation work right now without even calling it disaster mitigation. Because anytime we're working on housing or food security, making our communities stronger, more holistic, more resilient, we're doing things that will mitigate and decrease barriers for the future when disasters happen in our community. But one of the things that we say to our funders is, are you interested in children? Then, hey, like these disasters are going to impact children and they're going to impact education. And so you can get on board and think about how can your giving after a disaster in this community further your mission and make sure whatever that is, right? So we also encourage donors to think about the full arc of disasters, not just recovery, but we know that the scope of needs for recovery is the biggest part. So where do you start? Before a disaster, it's time to be intentional and to start thinking about those what ifs, like to have a plan and to not do that plan on your own, but to think about what happens if this happens, what am I going to do? And when it comes to that funding, we've already engaged, we've had thought around who's going to raise the funds for our community, where are those funds going to go? Are we in relationship with each other so we can have conversations about it? So we're not, as we say, exchanging business cards in those moments of crisis, but we built those community coalitions, those conversations, and we're thinking about the what if. What do you do right after a disaster? Bottom line is you don't go at this alone. So there's not only resources inside your community and other organizations. Disaster recovery is a cross-sector, multi-faceted response, and it takes everybody. So if you're at that point, you start collaborating and having conversations. You start connecting with resources from outside the community. Ask for help. There are professional disaster organizations and experts and people around you outside of your community that would be willing to come in and offer you suggestions, encouragement, support, and hope, right, in the midst of that. Talk to others, talk to those other community-based organizations and nonprofits. What are they doing? What do they need? Who's already collecting funds? Can we work together? Connect to, whether it's I've seen some communities call it a coalition. Some have something that's happening before the disaster called a COAD, a community organization active in disaster, that turns into a long-term recovery group. But as something, and if something begins to form around disaster recovery for your community, connect with that, understand what they're doing. And I would say if there isn't one, if nobody in your community is starting to gather people to start to have these conversations outside of emergency management, which is an important part to keep included in this, but if nobody's gathering that, then you be the one to start thinking about forming one and gathering it. Don't do this alone. If you're thinking about building a fund, right, you have to have this kind of coalition or group. I, as a funder looking at your community, if I want to come in and help, like I need to know that there's a will, that there's some sort of thing starting to coalesce around that. So form a long-term recovery group. Do that needs assessment. You really need to understand what happened, how did it happen, when did it happen, but most importantly, who did it happen to, and what does that mean? Start thinking about your budget, make a case statement, and do a strategy. So a lot of communities that I encounter kind of think that disaster giving is just going to come, right? We had an event and it was terrible, and now the money should just come. It should come. And instead, the unfortunate news is that you got to work at it. It's hard. It's a slog. It's difficult. And it doesn't just come. You have to have a plan and a strategy and engage that. You have to market your community in a lot of ways, which feels really hard for a lot of us because we always want to say, you know, somebody else has more need than I do. Somebody else probably needs it more than I do. But in a time of disaster at those kind of events, like, it's okay to say, wait a second, but we need it. It's okay to advocate for it. It's okay to ask for it and to yell for it and to insist that somebody comes and helps you in the way that you need it, not in the way they think you need it, but in the way that you need it and want it as a community. Think about your case statement, right? Again, who was impacted? What happened? Where was it? When did it happen? And how did it happen, right? So we want funders, we want to hear not only the story, we want to hear that story, but we also want to see the data, right? So a lot of communities don't know how many houses were actually damaged in this disaster. What does that mean? Do you know that an inch of water can be up to $20,000 worth of repairs in a basement. What are some of those stats and that data that you can provide to a funder to help them understand that it's really important that they invest in your community? How is this going to make your community and the people that live in your community's lives better? And how does it affect those parallel issues, right? So how did this disaster affect housing? How does it affect education in your community? How does it affect the public health of your community? And you start to put all of that together so that you're ready to go to a funder and you're ready to start that relationship. So get to know those funders. What's your link to their mission? And this is one of the most important one when you're thinking about foundations and philanthropic efforts, is don't always make that ask, right? I would say this: if you're looking for money, ask for advice. If you're looking for advice, ask for money. And so just develop that relationship and understanding with them. And if you're making the pitch, right, this is what we want at CDP to know. We want the story, we want the what, and we want the why. We also want the data. We want you to paint a picture with your words. It's easier if you write it in the third person. It makes it easier for me to get that and move that up through the chain to get funding to you. And just align that pitch with the appropriate funder. It seems obvious, but don't go to the education funder with a request for housing. It happens all the time, but if you have aligned, you're working effectively and strategically, and you're not wasting your time as you're doing that. Funders like CDP, we're going to reduce the barriers as much as possible to get to that place to say yes. So we're going to work with you for a long time. I wish everybody was like that. I, at the point with small communities, will write the grant for somebody and just walk through the entire process to make sure that those dollars get to them. Others don't. I wish that everybody had that kind of ability to do that. But again, I'm happy to help kind of figure those pieces out with you as you're thinking about it for your community. Once you have that funding, utilize those existing or emergency coalitions in your community. Don't duplicate, don't do it alone. There is a system. The system, the experience, we know that if you quickly write checks and hand them out to everybody and give everybody the same amount of money, your community that's not going to be helpful or useful for your community in the long term. So ask for help and figure out what some of those systems are. Talk about it regularly. And we're gonna move into questions here in a second, but I'm just gonna tie on to what Maria said in her session, right? This last one is to celebrate the successes and the wins, to celebrate the progress along the way. Because one of the things that disaster really does to communities is it can suck the hope and the joy. It can cause a lot of heartache. There's a lot of often political fighting and personal fighting, and how come so-and-so didn't do this? And there's a lot of blame, and there's a lot of, there can be a lot of contention and conflict in the midst of disaster. But there also can be a lot of things to celebrate. And so I would say this: don't wait till all 15 houses that you want to rebuild are done. Start with the first one. Start with the muck out. Hey, we got this house cleaned out. Now we're going to move on to this. Like, celebrate those little pieces and those little progresses along the way, because that's going to keep you going for the next house and the next house and the next family that comes in front of you with need, to make that happen for your whole community. So I know that I just blew through a whole bunch of information really, really fast. I feel like I did. And so I'm happy to answer any questions right now. You can raise your hand, you can come off mute, you can put it in the chat box, whatever you're most comfortable with. But at the end of the day, I'm also just gonna offer this to you. Here's my email address, always available for questions and conversation. I'd love to engage with you and strategize with you in whatever way that I can around disaster funding, and especially around the needs of rural communities after disaster as they work towards recovery. So I'm going to just stop sharing so I can see you all again. And I see there's a question in the chat here. Is there a space in the larger conversation to educate funders on their critical part of financially supporting communities rather than a reactive? Yeah, so we are constantly working towards that and constantly looking at how do we kind of elevate that message that we can't just look at disaster as events that happen. We have to understand the whole context of the community. We have to understand the funders need to understand the mitigation needs. They need to understand those preparedness needs, and they need to put their dollars behind those pieces and move towards that. So that conversation is starting to happen, and I really hope that it continues to happen in larger ways. I also see federal funding moving more and more towards that and towards that understanding. As additional programs roll out, there's more and more conversations that I'm seeing around that mitigation and preparedness efforts. And moving, I would say the other thing is moving that preparedness conversation beyond the individual household level of, have your go bag and, just be ready to go when something happens, to a community level, to thinking about how are we as a community ready, not only to, how are we ready to respond when a disaster happens, and how are we ready to handle the stressor, but how do we make ourselves better before those things happen so that we minimize the impact and the effect of these events when they do happen in our community. Do we have experience providing disaster relief to request funds as opposed to letting the Red Cross, Department of Mental Health, or other agency? Can you tell me a little bit more about the question?
Yeah, this is Luis Rodriguez.
Hi.
Hi. So we have, we do housing, and we have a lot of need that we see. We've never had requested any funds for disaster relief. We've done some rehab work in our normal course of work, and FEMA normally comes down and Red Cross gets involved, and we think they got it handled. So, if we wanted to get deeper into helping, should we be the agency that requests funds to provide mental health or go back or other things to our people?
I would say yes. Like if you're noticing that that's a gap, and you're noticing that these things that you're not getting to complete and whole recovery for your community, and your agency is willing to stand up and say, hey, like we'll take this on. It requires also being intentional with funders to say, we also need additional capacity to be able to do this. So asking for, the ability to have additional staff, or to have additional, dollars to pay for the infrastructure and the operation of your organization, so you can add a different layer on. But yes, your organization can, and I would contend perhaps should be asking for those dollars on behalf of your community. So
thank you. We've been around a while and we know how to help, but we never have tried to get deep into the help arena when it comes to mental health or financial help and things like that. That'd be very helpful. That's capacity building. Wow, right there.
yeah, that's capacity building. And if you already have funders who are funding you because of housing, right? Housing would probably, in my sense, be the easiest connection back to disaster, right? Because disasters typically cause issues with housing. So I think you would have some pretty good connections and tie-ins already there. So
thank you.
And Kendra popped an answer to that question in the chat for you as well. Let me see this other question. Suggestions. Extreme political polarization. That's that the COVID, what we've seen with this politicization during COVID has just been like an exaggeration in a lot of ways of what we see happen in many communities after disaster, right? There tends to be always a need to blame someone. And I do spend a lot of time listening to communities kind of need to vent about, so-and-so is supposed to do this and they didn't do that. And now we're stuck in this place and what are we supposed to do? I don't know on a broader scale, that's not really my expertise as to how to help that. But I would say on the small scale, it's being that person that can listen, that can take all of that in and just go, wow, that's a lot. That's really hard. Let me reflect back to you what I'm hearing. And then can we come to the one, and sometimes it seems really small, right? The one little thing that we can do to do that. And maybe it is celebrate. So another strategy that we've seen sometimes work in communities, but not always, is having more of a talking circle type of an environment where there's a really good facilitator. I've seen extension agents be able to facilitate these kind of meetings really well, where everybody just gets the opportunity to express what they're thinking, what's going on. They take notes and then they reflect that back to leadership in different ways. But this COVID and the polarization of that is just kind of is just a whole nother thing that's going to take us a while. It's part of long-term, it's part of our recovery from COVID, is figuring out what we're going to do about that. I don't have any great answers. I would like to wave my magic wand that I keep back here because my boss gave me a magic wand, but it never actually works. So. Absolutely. So, and that helps me, Sarah, reflect like that COVID has also created all these opportunities for us to think about our communities differently, to think about the way that we support people and all of those pieces and how they all intersect, right? We can't ignore this idea that all of these systems in our community intersects, and we need all of them, and we need them all to be, shored up and lifted up in the midst of that. And then again, the disaster, why it seems like an event in a specific time frame, but COVID is blown that out of the water as well. And so these disasters can last for years. And so we can no longer think of them in these segmented phases, like we recover, or we do relief, and then we do response, and then we do recovery, and then we do preparedness. Like we have to do all of it all the time at the same time as we're moving forward. And there are simple things like changing regulations and changing those things, which seem simple on the outside, but they're big, huge things to be able to do. So Kendra, thanks I realize it's one, I'm gonna turn it back to you. Thank you for letting me be here and sharing today.
No, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Carrie. There was even a few things that I learned on that I didn't know. So I very much appreciate it. We will be, like I said, sharing the slides and the recordings on our website. This will all be available. So you'll be able to hear it again and see some of those stats and things that Carrie had that you can maybe even use in some of your conversations with potential funders. But in the meantime, we're at time. So I just want to thank you all for attending, and I hope to see you at our last session. So have a good one.